Let's go back in time. Not quite that far. Our timeline begins in 2009. It's a story about how having hard conversations in the church can rupture relationships, but avoiding them or doing them with poor process can do even worse damage. I'm talking about the division within and between Mennonite Church Canada and the Canadian Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches around issues of gender and sexuality, specifically around the inclusion and exclusion of 2S LGBTQIA+ people in the church. As of the making of this episode in the summer of 2026, the story is ongoing. This is He Said, She Said, Part 2. I'm Marnie Clausen. Welcome to the schism between us. In part 1, we took a deep dive into Ed Wilm's story. Now it's time to zoom out and take a bird's eye view of the last 17 years and the timeline of events that get us to today. I want to situate you within the broader context of an ongoing story. First, a few content warnings. If you're someone who is sensitive to themes of exclusion based on gender identity and sexual orientation, mental health and suicidal ideation, or messy church politics in general, I want you to take good care of yourself while listening. The themes and stories in this episode can be upsetting, and if you need to take a break or stop listening altogether, that's more than okay. Also, I want to acknowledge that this is an episode about 2S LGBTQIA+ people and issues. That stands for two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer and questioning, intersex, and asexual and aromantic. Several of the main voices you're going to hear belong to straight cis men, and that's actually on purpose. I have no desire to place queer voices in harm's way, and it happens that these men are friends of mine who have been at the center of some of these conversations and events. Are you ready? Let's get into it.
It is by ballot, and you have those ballots in your packet. And those wishing to abstain may mark the ballot with abstain. The vote count is based on those who are voting yes or no, and those who mark their ballots as an abstention will be recorded, but they're not recorded in the vote.
The audio you're hearing comes from the 2016 National Gathering of Mennonite Church Canada in Saskatoon. They're about to vote on BFC 7, a recommendation by the Being a Faithful Church Task Force to allow congregations to interpret the confession of faith in a Mennonite perspective differently, especially as it relates to definitions of marriage and guidelines around sexuality.
Once you have marked your ballot,
the vote itself was done by ballot and counted later, so it's not very dramatic to listen to. But I'll let you in on the outcome. They passed the recommendation. That's 10 years ago.
We will close in prayer. So right now, Laura, would you lead us in singing?
The Being a Faithful Church, or BFC, process began back in 2009. It was a way for the Mennonite Church to have a national conversation about gender, sexuality, and the biblical interpretations and theologies we hold around these topics. After BFC 7 passed, many MC Canada communities rejoiced that they could now remain within their church family while also affirming the queer people in their midst. I wasn't part of the Mennonite Church then, so I can't speak from my own memory of the process. But as I joined only 2 years later in 2018, I heard many whispers of pain in that process. the Mennonite church did something very hard and had a big, scary conversation in public.
As I understand it, in the British Columbia Conference, during the BFC 7 question and conversation, there was a real crisis of unity, because as churches were uncomfortable with the decisions of Mennonite Church Canada, they were choosing to leave in various ways, whether it was choosing to only associate with a British Columbia conference, so those would be called area church only congregations, or to leave the Mennonite Church altogether.
That's Graham McCarthy. Graham's a buddy of mine, and also happens to be a newish Mennonite, and the pastor of Peace Church on 52nd in Vancouver, which is part of Mennonite Church British Columbia. Graham sent me some voice memos last week as I was trying to paint a clearer picture of what had happened in BC after MC Canada passed BFC 7. In 2017, Mennonite Church BC passed Resolution 1, a statement that effectively put a ceiling on how affirming churches in the region could become. It was the result of turmoil in the regional church, with churches threatening to leave the conference on both the affirming and non-affirming ends of things.
What Resolution 1 did was it provided a way for the churches to feel comfortable staying together. My assessment of it was that what was chosen was the option that made absolutely everybody unhappy. There was no winning in the conversation of Resolution 1. However, as I understand it, this was the way to keep the conference together. And we still lost churches from it. My understanding of it, and of course I'm speaking as a straight guy, as a MCBC pastor who came in far later than the Resolution 1, is that the question that our church was addressing was less of sexuality and more a question of unity.
Since 2017, many MC Canada churches in other regions have become affirming of 2S LGBTQIA+ people in marriage and church leadership, while others have left the conference, or stayed and maintained a range of more traditional positions. Let's fast forward to 2021. It's January, and Artisan Church has just published a document. The document in question? It's called Milestone Statement on LGBTQ+ Inclusion, and it positions Artisan, then part of the BC Mennonite Brethren Conference, as a third way, or Side C church. What's a Side C church, you ask? Well, first you need to know about Sides A and B. Side A refers to churches that hold the position that a Christian understanding of sexuality can affirm 2S LGBTQIA+ people as created in the image of God, and thus blesses them to participate in church leadership and marriage. Side B, on the other hand, holds a traditional view of marriage as between one man and one woman, and commends celibacy as the only rightful alternative to marriage. That means that whether you're straight or queer, you're only supposed to have sex within the context of heterosexual and monogamous marriage. That brings us to Side C. Side C, or sometimes called Third Way, refers to Christian communities which essentially agree to disagree on issues of gender and sexuality. Side C prioritizes unity over right belief and is affirming of queer people in marriage and church leadership, but equally affirming of non-affirming people in full participation in their community life. Without getting into too much detail, the BC Mennonite Brethren Conference reacted quickly, and by the end of March of that year, Artisan had withdrawn its membership from the conference. Their pastor, Nelson Boschman, had surrendered his pastoral license held with the denomination. It's important to note here that though they technically left voluntarily, Artisan wanted to stay. It became pretty clear that staying was not going to be a viable option, though, hence their rapid exit. Okay, still with me? Artisan published their milestone statement in January of 2021, Now we're fast forwarding to June of that same year. A group of lay leaders in the MB Church, including John Unger, Carissa Durant, Janelle Friesen, and Janessa Naylor-Giesbrecht, hosted their first virtual listening event under the name A Time to Listen. This followed an open letter written by some of the same folks following Artisan's exit from the denomination. The national body, the Canadian Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches, or CCMBC, had responded to the letter publicly on the MB Herald website and said that, and I quote, "The National Faith and Life team does not think that there are adequate arguments for hosting a conversation on revising our confession's convictions about marriage and same-sex intimacy, Articles 10 and 11 of the MB Confession of Faith. We believe that the best path forward is for our churches and leaders to affirm and teach what we believe are biblically faithful convictions, while at the same time applying them in ways that fit the sacrificial way of Jesus in the world." Well, A Time to Listen went ahead and held a conversation anyway, and people showed up. They ended up hosting 9 virtual listening and dialogue events over almost 2 years. A lot happened during those 2 years, but before we carry on with more timeline, I want to take some time to dive into one church's story of listening, followed by deep pain and poor process.
When Artisan Church had recently issued their milestone statement, going public with what they call a third way and making space for a multiplicity of views related to human sexuality, I believe that rattled the denominational leaders. And their big learning was that they had let Artisan get way too far in their process without intervention or oversight by the denomination. And so next on the list of Mennonite Brethren BC churches was Cedar Park in terms of who else is having conversations.
That's Lee Kosa, co-pastor of Estuary Church in Ladner, BC. I first met Lee in 2018 when he spent a week at CMU as pastor in residence while I was a student there.
Yeah, I was at Cedar Park just shy of 10 years. So that came to an end in the spring of 2022.
I spoke with Lee earlier this week over video call and asked him about his time at Cedar Park.
So we had quite a mix. Some people were at our church because we were in the Mennonite Brethren Conference and they had an ethnic, Mennonite background, and that was part of their lineage and their family faith story. And an equal amount of people, probably more so, had no connection to Mennonites.
Lee tells me about the rich theological diversity that Cedar Park held during his years there. There were different ideas about salvation, the cross, mission, you name it.
For a long time, Cedar Park was able to welcome this large or wide tension spectrum of beliefs and practices when it came to following Jesus. And then in 2019, it was, I believe, maybe the first year that the United Church had officially adopted June as Pride Month in the church. And our local United Church had a pride flag hung above their entryway in celebration of Pride Month, and it was vandalized. And in response to that vandalism, somebody had gone around to all the local churches in the cover of darkness and hung up large pride flags outside of many churches in our town, including Cedar Park's.
For a church that tried to be welcoming to a range of people, but was not formally affirming, this, of course, caused quite a conundrum. After some group discussion and discernment with the elders of the church, they decided to take down the flag.
And so our rationale was many parts, but some of them were, we think it would be incongruent as a church that is an official member of the Mennonite Brethren Conference of Churches of British Columbia to hang a pride flag out front because it might signal that we are a completely affirming church. That meaning that there is no ceiling or limit to belonging for anybody, for any reasons related to their sexuality or their orientation. And that just wasn't true. For example, for me as a credentialed pastor, I couldn't perform a same-sex wedding.
Lee and the elders explained 3 things in their message to the congregation the following Sunday.
1, it would be incongruent for the flag to remain. 2, we want to listen and hear the voices of anyone who feel that their voice hasn't been heard. And then 3, we need to find out if there are limits to our inclusion that are set by the conference, because that's important for us as we try to create a community of belonging for anyone who shows up.
The event sparked a period of listening for Cedar Park, a time of discerning what their core values as a community were. They asked a lot of questions together.
And so we asked ourselves as a church, what kind of sorting do we need to do? Is there anything in our garage that's gone rancid that we need to take out to the curb?
At some point during this period of listening and discernment, some members of Cedar Park got nervous and reached out to conference leadership to let them in on what was going on. They ended up in a meeting, conference leadership with leaders from Cedar Park, and the Cedar Park contingent had a lot of curiosities for the conference.
Those leaders then, we ended that meeting and the leader said, we're going to put together some summary statements about what we talked about. We'll send them back to you as a church so that you can see what we heard. And once you ratify them and we're on the same page that we've heard each other, we'll move forward and you can share those with your congregation. Well, months went by and we didn't get the summary statement. And in July, I indicated that, this lack of response is just generating a lot of kind of gossip in the community. I think people were wondering, well, are elders and pastors hiding something from us? Or is the denomination hiding something from us? Like, what's going on? People started to be very suspicious. So it was getting bad.
Eventually, in late July of that year, the church finally got a letter from conference leadership.
It was more than the summary statements. It essentially brought to light that the denomination had launched an investigation of sorts into my pastoral ministry and had not alerted any of the church leadership, including myself. But I guess there were, in that gap, when the church was waiting and there were suspicions, people from our church reaching out to the conference with concerns. And then the conference was listening and then getting nervous and then like, okay, we better investigate Lee Kosa and see what's going on. What is he teaching? Once I found out that an investigation had been happening about me without my knowledge for months, my anxiety just went through the roof. And in hindsight, I really wish when it came to light that I was being investigated, that somebody had said, okay, if you are being investigated for sort of being out of alignment with the confession of faith or sort of malpractice as a pastor as defined by the denomination, perhaps pastoring in ways that didn't fit their criteria or requirements for a pastor, that I should be put on leave while that investigation was carried out. But that wasn't the case.
Lee continued his pastoral work, diving into a difficult season of ministering to grieving congregants and doing some tough things like memorial services following tragic deaths in the community.
And I remember just the anxiety being so bad one morning before getting out of bed, just thinking, God, I don't think I can do this. And then my mind just went to, is there just some way I could end this all right now? And that's where thoughts of self-harm and suicidal ideation began. My doctor later would put words clinical depression around it. But it was awful. It was awful.
Soon, denominational leaders called Lee to a meeting.
It was sort of described, it would be a meeting of discernment, and this was just more like an interrogation and trying to get me to say what they thought they needed pastors to say in order to be, to get the stamp of the denomination. At that time, the confession of faith was talked about in a way. There was a document called The Nature and Function of the Confession of Faith. And there was a distinction between principled agreement and a rigid agreement. And it made room for a principled agreement that said, at times we understand people may go through questions and experience tension related to some of our doctrinal statements in our confession of faith. Like, that's reality. That is just reality. Everybody does that if they're honest with themselves. And so that's what I thought there was space. They didn't love my responses to their questions. And they sent me a letter essentially saying I needed to prove my unequivocal commitment to the confession of faith. Those are the words. They really wanted to drill down and be like, look, in your heart of hearts, do you believe this or not? Are you in line with the confession of faith or not? But then when I left, I just had this sense. And when I got their letters, I knew, yeah, I can't do that. So, I wrote back saying, as a convinced Anabaptist, our people know what it's like to have creeds, doctrinal statements used against them, and to brand them as heretics, and to be used as weapons. And so that's why we as a people confess our faith. We talk about what we believe it looks like to follow Jesus. And that changes over time, as it has with women in ministry and other issues. And it will change again. And I said, and because I'm a convinced Anabaptist, the only thing that I will give my unequivocal commitment to is Jesus. So they sent back a letter saying, in light of your response, we are pulling your credentials as a pastor in the Mennonite Brethren Conference.
Lee found himself pastoring a church in a denomination that was clearly telling him they didn't want him in the role. So he made the difficult decision to resign.
The other pastoral colleague had already resigned earlier in the process, but there were two of us left, and we both submitted our resignations at the same time. All the elders but one also left their positions. And then you had a church without any pastoral staff. And so the denomination called a meeting. And that has been described as the meeting from hell. And it was that not knowing, and then knowing I was investigated, but I didn't know what the investigation meant, or who was watching and who was listening, or what was next, that was caused so much anguish and just drained my mental health to the point of suicidality. And I wasn't getting answers that were satisfying to these questions, so I went. And in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have.
Lee showed up to the meeting and found the room full.
There were hundreds of people. People showed up who hadn't been in church in months. And I came to there was a chance to ask some questions. I came to the front. I asked questions. At one point, I asked the person in charge, I said, I'm under the understanding that I am being possibly labeled a false teacher by some of your denominational colleagues. Do you believe I am a false teacher?
Calling someone a false teacher is a serious spiritual and moral indictment within Christianity, and especially within evangelical Christianity. The phrase is taken directly from the New Testament and implies that a faith leader is not simply wrong about something, but is actively and maybe even knowingly leading people away from Christ. It's a serious accusation, one that cuts deep.
Keep in mind that those labeled false teachers in our lineage, our spiritual ancestors, were drowned in rivers when this accusation is made. And, I don't know if he was just trying to say what he, to back up his colleagues, but he said, yes, I do think that. And it was just like a gut punch of like, really? So this really is a life and death matter. And it doesn't matter whose health, whose sort of this side of heaven we destroy, if it means safeguarding what leads to eternal salvation, eternal life. That is the logic. The wheels came off the meeting. People started shouting from their seats. And during the meeting, somebody had, a dear woman who had recently identified as queer, was holding a sign that said love in rainbow lettering and had walked up on stage behind the denominational leaders and stood under the cross with the sign midway through the meeting. And during the meeting, as the wheels are coming off, more and more people are joining her. I went to the front one last time, and I confessed, this process has been so hard on me, and it has robbed me of my mental health. This has been so bad for me that I have been at the point of suicidality, and I want you to know that. And my body at that point just had a trauma response of flight, and I turned around, all the eyes on me, the electricity in the room, and then I turned my heel and was walking out. I said, I'm done. My nervous system was overloaded. I walked out of the church and I collapsed in the bushes in the garden, and I just started to wail, holding my knees to my chest, and I just cried, letting out months of emotion. But also, it had felt like what was happening in that room was so violent that it felt like a desecration of the Lord's body.
As I listen to Lee tell his story, I close my eyes. He's tearing up, and so am I. It's a hard story. Lee starts to reflect on the aftermath.
I noticed months later, there's a stained glass window above the spot in the garden where I was crying, and there's a cross in it. And for me, there was just a moment in hindsight of, this is the mystical solidarity that we see in a co-suffering Christ. A solidarity with the cast out, with the wounded, with the scapegoated. This is where Jesus is found. But I think I just experienced a little bit of insight and solidarity with the Christ who's taken outside the city and is crucified, and with a long line of minoritized people, women, queer folks, non-white people who have found themselves cast out. And that is the deep grief within me for my former denomination, that I think we're missing the Spirit knocking on the door, like Cornelius's guys who came to call Peter, and that we are putting bodies up against the door to prevent it from opening because we think it's a threat, and our eternal salvation is online, and bar the doors, batten down the hatches, tighten the screws, rally together, reaffirm the confession of faith, lest we lose our identity. And I get it. There is a threat when difference shows up at the door. But gosh, what if it's Jesus? And I bet my career that it is.
Lee's story is a heavy one. It's filled with ruptured relationships and violence done to curious people asking questions. I hear it as a story of what can happen when we avoid hard conversations for the sake of the party line. Among all that was going on, the events at Cedar Park spurred journalist John Longhurst, whom we heard from in episode 1, to start a blog. He called it, aptly, A Time to Tell. For 2 years, from March 2022 until March of 2024, John chronicled the happenings in the CCMBC related to queer inclusion and exclusion on the blog. It's been a really helpful resource to me as I've been building a clearer picture of the last few years for myself. I'll link it in the show notes down below. In the early summer of 2022, a book was launched, edited by acclaimed writer Dora Duick. The book in question is called On Holy Ground: Stories by and about Women in Ministry Leadership in the Mennonite Brethren Church. Before the launch of the book, but after it had gone to press, the CCMBC ordered that the printing be stopped and all existing copies destroyed. They printed a new version with 3 pages removed. Those 3 pages were part of an essay by Mary Ann Isaac. Mary Ann is the longtime pastor of River East Church in Winnipeg, formerly River East MB Church. Her essay had, according to the conference, and I quote from their formal response, suddenly departed to record reflections, experiences, and questions about her evolving perspective on gay, queer, and transgender folks and the MB Church, end quote. Mary Ann had reflected on her experience as a woman in ministry in the MB Church, as assigned, and a big part of her story was the impact that issues of queer inclusion had had on her life and ministry. Those 3 pages are available online, and I'll link that in the show notes as well. The controversy around the publication of On Holy Ground involved a series of protests across the country, including one that I participated in here in Winnipeg, right outside the CCMBC offices. The conference never responded to that peaceful event. Meanwhile, in Ontario, the story we heard in part 1 was playing out. In September of that year, Ed Wilms was ousted as executive director of the Ontario MB Conference. In October and November, Free Church and Southridge were suspended from the conference, only to be formally removed mere months later. It was right around the same time, in fall 2022, that Jubilee Mennonite Church was suspended by the MB Church of Manitoba. Remember Mary and Gilbert from episode 2? During that same conversation I had with them back last fall, Mary told me about being part of Jubilee at that time.
Well, yeah, it was a process, a multi-year process. We had really good leadership. Ken Workington was our interim pastor at the time, and he led us through a very, very good process because it was threatening to, split the church. There were people who said, well, if we become affirming, we can't be here anymore because that just doesn't align with our theology. Right. But he sort of gently led us through the process, and at the same time we talked about conference affiliation. Many people at Jubilee were not very interested in conferences. Conference attendance was always, there were a few of us who would go to the MC conference and a few of us who'd go to the MB conferences annually. But the group as such was much more interested in what happens locally.
Mary goes on to talk about Jubilee's broader approaches to marriage, divorce, singleness, and sexuality.
For us to say that diversity is acceptable, we'll accept you here, whether you're married, divorced, single, straight, gay, whatever, that's not the determining factor of your membership here. And that, of course, then clashed with the MB's very firm stance. That became the litmus test. That we were supposed to affirm the confession of faith in its entirety, is what they said.
Right.
And we agreed that you don't really do that anyway. But even on this article saying that a marriage is a covenant between a man and a woman for life, said, okay, well, we dropped the for life part. It's still there, but it hasn't been enforced. There was a time when the MB Church would excommunicate anybody who got divorced. Really.
So why are we stuck on this? On the first part of the line?
Stuck on the first part of the line. But it seemed like that was just Hard line, yeah, cast in stone, never mind sand. Yeah. And so, and I guess we had quite a few meetings. I was on church council at the time. We had quite a few meetings with the leadership of the Manitoba MB conference. So we would talk about it and they say, well, this is a problem. But it seemed like we could talk about it with some of the leaders. And then a few days or a week or so later, we'd get a letter summarizing kind of what the meeting was. And it was much more hardline than what we had been talking about with the people.
Mary tells me about the meeting in which the decision was made that Jubilee would be removed from the regional conference.
So it wasn't very surprising when we had the annual meeting and we were expelled. What was really painful was some of the vitriol that was thrown at us, that, we were a cancerous branch that had to be cut off the tree because we would infect the whole tree. There were some that were even worse, that we were not biblical, that the devil was reigning in our midst, and we had to be cast out for the health of the body.
Back in Winnipeg, a group of retired Mennonite Brethren pastors and conference leaders had planned an event called Open Space in January of 2023. David Wiebe, John Unger, James Taves, and Danny Unrau organized and hosted the event at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Open Space events are dialogue events for 2S LGBTQIA+ people and their allies within and at the periphery of the MB Church, to discuss queer inclusion in and exclusion from the church. Since 2023, Open Space events have been held in Ontario and BC, and another one is scheduled to take place in Winnipeg this fall. In January of 2024, River East Church was formally removed from the MB Church of Manitoba, following long and substantive efforts to remain in conversation and relationship with the conference. And then, in January of 2025, and that's only a year and a half ago, FaithWorks, a longtime church community of the MB Church of Manitoba, left the conference of their own accord, adopting an inclusivity statement, which can be found on their website. The story's not over, not for either denomination. I want to recognize that these past two episodes have focused unevenly on the Mennonite Brethren Church. I believe that this issue is a substantial cause of the current rift between these two denominations. And so in order to understand the schism between us, we have to understand the context of each group. For example, Douglas Mennonite Church in Winnipeg recently left Mennonite Church Manitoba and has, just this year, entered into an associate relationship with the Mennonite Brethren Church of Manitoba, seeking to align themselves with a confession of faith that has a more traditional view of marriage. What's happened at Douglas over the past few years is, of course, way more complex than that. And I know that a lot of people and relationships have been damaged. That's almost certainly true of all of the churches I've mentioned in this episode. These conversations and decisions don't come about easily or lightly, and there is too often collateral damage in the form of trauma and torn apart relationships and communities.
I think we're in a really awkward spot. Of course, I don't speak authoritatively. This is just my reflection on it. But it all comes down to the question of unity. How is our church going to hold on to unity? As I look at it, and as I have engaged with the conversation, that is the core of it, is how is our conference going to maintain unity in the midst of these questions?
Is unity the goal? If we put up a big tent, who gets in? And who's still left out? I'm continuing to hold these questions.
it shows me how tense our unity can be, and how we can hold unity with suspicion, and how we can hold unity with fear, and how we can hold unity maybe even unhappily. And it's an interesting spot to be. I don't know what to do with it all the time. I am grateful that I'm part of the Mennonite Church in British Columbia. I'm grateful that I'm part of the Mennonite Church in Canada. And I'm also grateful to be unified with all of these people while we're trying to sort out what unity means, and while we're trying to sort out what unity looks like. It grieves me that our church holds this unity so tensely and so suspiciously and so fearfully. And I look forward to a day when we can hold it with joy. I don't know how or when that will happen, but I hope to hold unity with joy.
Thank you for listening to The Schism Between Us. I'm your host, Marnie Clausen. This series is supported by Menno Creative, a program of Canadian Mennonite Magazine. Some amazing friends and collaborators made this story possible. At the beginning, and again now, you've heard an arrangement of In the Rifted Rock, arranged by Michaela Turner and performed by Marta Bonnet-Wiebe, Allegra Friesenepp, Matthew Veith, Solomon Schlegel, Courtney Kuhl-Schlegel, and Isaac Kuhl-Schlegel. Background music was composed and recorded by Jamie Terpstra. Graphic design by Tiff Wu. Sound design and technical production by Matthew Veith. A big thank you to Susan Fish for her ongoing support. And a special thank you to John Longhurst and Lee Kosa for helping me fact-check dates for this episode. And thank you, dear listener, for listening. Take care of yourself.